Key Concept 6.1 is about science and the environment. What the AP really wants you to know is about the rapid advances in science and how science altered the understanding of the universe and the natural world, and how science has led to the development of new technologies. These changes will enable unprecedented population growth. The population growth isn't necessarily from having babies, it's actually partly because people are living longer because our health standards are so much better. Which altered how, and this population growth alters how humans interact with the environment, which basically causes serious environmental damages because we have such a large population, and threaten delicate ecological balances at local, regional, and global levels. Roman numeral I is about how researchers made rapid advances in science that spread throughout the world, and this is assisted by the development of new technology. Letter A, new modes of communication and transportation virtually eliminated the problem of geographic distance. Now this is true throughout the world. Basically, a scientist in China can Skype or FaceTime with a scientist at Boston University, and that advances science so much quicker, and it allows for the spread of ideas so much faster than it used to be. New modes of communication actually include the telephone. The telephone was patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. Telephones became readily available to the public throughout the 1950s. In the 1950s, the lines were set up where you would have an operator who actually connected individual phone lines. So it was very expensive to install a phone into your house. A lot of the old Victorian mansions back into the 1920s had one phone that served the entire household. And again, it wasn't really available for most of the public until the 1950s. The Internet. The Internet actually began as a U.S. government project. Basically, the U.S. government wanted to create some type of information systems back in the 1960s. It was used by governments in the academic world up until the 1980s, and then it becomes widespread in the 1990s. So throughout the 70s and the 80s, the government and the academic world, like colleges and universities, were developing this this way of storing data and sharing it through computer systems, and that's basically what the Internet becomes. In 2012, 2.4 billion people had used the Internet at least once in their lifetime. Now, you guys use it at least 5 or 6 times a day, but the availability of smartphones, which is so brand new, has completely changed the access to the Internet. Cell phones was a new mode of communication when in the early 2000s. Believe it or not, high school students who graduated pre-2000 did not have a cell phone. The first handheld mobile phone was developed by a guy named Motorola in 1973. You can see the evolution of the cell phone in this picture, and it actually doesn't even have a smartphone on there, so this is even outdated. The first car phones that were used in the 80s actually had to have a huge bag with them for the satellite communication, and now that they figured out the cell towers and things like that, obviously the phone's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. The other problem was powering them. Believe it or not, you used to have to always have some type of battery device connected to your cell phone. Now batteries are much smaller. Cell phones became commercially available in 83, and obviously from up to 2011, mobile phone users went from 12.4 million in 1990 to over 6 billion. Telephone access and cell phone access has changed the world. Cell phone towers are actually a lot cheaper to install than individual telephone lines. So a lot of rural areas are actually getting cell phone towers and skipping the whole landline thing. They never actually had a telephone in their home, but they do have a cell phone. Now, we're not talking smartphones quite yet. You're not going to see a smartphone in the middle of China, but rural areas are gaining access to communication devices through these cell phone towers, and governments are using cell phones to interact with their people as well, and it also will improve health and emergency services and things like that. One of the newest things about cell phones is the social media. The use of social media through the smartphones has changed things like revolutions, the way that people speak to their governments. So you can tweet the president if you want. He may or may not respond. I'm sure he himself is not actually running his Twitter account, but I'm sure he has someone whom he trusts who approves everything. The Pope has his own Twitter account now. And these government leaders are using the internet to communicate with their constituents. On the other side, when you're in a country like China or Hong Kong, where they recently had a rebellion, in Taiwan, Hong Kong's not a country, by the way, but Taiwan, the rebels are actually using social media to and create rebellions through their cell phones. And in fact, they're actually using these things. So, for example, Taiwan was protesting against being under the control of the Chinese recently in the past year, and they were basically doing a protest down in the public squares and into the major cities. And what they did was they actually would tweet out or Instagram out, hey, we need water over in this area, and people would show up with water. So they were able to continue their protests for longer because their needs were being met through the use of social media. Part B, new scientific paradigms transformed the human understanding of the world. Now, up to this point, we have used religion to explain the world. And then, of course, we've started in the 1600s, the early 14 to 1600s with the scientific revolution, with things like the heliocentric theory. We figure out anatomy and medicine and things like that. Nothing compares to what has happened to science in the past 100 years. The theory of relativity is an explanation of how and why the universe works the way that it does. There's two theories by Einstein in regards to the theory of relativity. You have special relativity and general relativity. Basically, Einstein's theory is that all measures are relative. In other words, human beings have created measurement. That's the idea of the theory of relativity, is that when we are saying that an atom weighs so many grams, that's something that human beings have created, not necessarily science itself. And this has impacted the worldview, since we haven't had a change in the worldviews like this since Newton. Remember, with Newton, the worldview changed in regards to science because of the idea of the Earth existing without a godlike figure. And here, now we have Einstein saying that the world exists because of the way that we have defined it. This is a very philosophical idea, but that it definitely applies to science. If you are a physicist, your job is to try to come up with theories and prove that your theory is right through these measurements that are technically arbitrary. So you may not actually be accomplishing anything in the field of science, according to Einstein's theory of relativity. Quantum mechanics is a field of physics that deals with the universe's materials at a nanoscopic scale. So we're talking like tiny, itty-bitty, microscopic little atoms, smaller than anything we can even imagine. It gives a mathematical description of particles. Quantum mechanics is super important in regards to science and in regards to especially things like medicine. Development of things like chemotherapy or radiation therapy is super important with the idea of using these particles and on these nanoscopic scales. We have made massive improvements in cancer treatments through things like proton therapy and things like that that are associated with working with these materials on this small of a scale. Big Bang Theory, not this one actually, I mean something else. Big Bang Theory explains the creation of the universe. Those who follow the Big Bang Theory and believe that it is correct feels that the Big Bang happened 13.82 billion years ago, and it began at an extremely hot state and then suddenly cooled. As it cooled, electrons, protons, and neutrons formed, and as a result we get organisms, and as a result we eventually get human beings. But it took thousands and thousands and thousands of years to cool off, and that's why the planet existed and why it took so long for human beings to even exist. Psychology. Psychology was a new field in the mid-1800s. People really did not understand why people lost their minds or became mentally unstable. For example, King George III. King George III in the late 1700s, no one understood what caused him to suddenly start talking to trees. Really, it was that he had too much copper in his blood and that was impacting his mental capabilities. Psychology takes science and applies it to human behavior. It basically takes science and tries to explain why we act the way that we do. There's three types of psychologists. You have your behavioral psychologist, your cognitive psychologist, and your social psychologist. All three types of psychologists have a different theory on the explanation for why we behave the way that we do. Sigmund Freud develops what's called psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis is just a method of psychology that attempts to help and modify behavior through talk therapy. This is a behavior, Sigmund Freud could be considered a behaviorist, and that he felt that you could actually change the way that you behave by talking through things and maybe changing the way that a human being actually thinks about the way that they live their lives, and that they can, that sometimes mental disabilities are associated with their surroundings. Obviously, Freud has affected human behavior on a large scale, where many people are now using talk therapy as a way to cope with stress or deal with other issues throughout their life. Cognitive psychologists tend to work more with things like medicine, that there's issues wrong with the perhaps hormones and things like that. Social psychologists do a lot with how you were brought up can impact the way that you act as an adult. Sigmund Freud takes all three of these things into consideration for sure. He developed several different psychological terms and concepts that are really important. One of them is libido. Libido is our sexual desires, and Sigmund Freud felt that most humans actually are motivated by fulfilling sexual desires, and that all of our behaviors can pretty much be explained when looking at humans' basic sexual desires. He also developed the concept of the unconscious. The unconscious is basically our behaviors that come out that we don't necessarily even know that they're there. We are unaware of what our brain does. We barely use the majority of our brain, and Freud feels like that area that we don't use actually impacts our behavior. Transference is an idea where we transfer a lot of our emotions onto other people as a way to relieve stress within ourselves. This is something that's become super prevalent in, I think, generations today. The idea that it's not my fault. It's so that you don't necessarily have to take responsibility for your behaviors. You basically are saying that somebody else caused you to act the way that you do. Dream analysis is very important to Sigmund Freud. He felt that dream analysis gave you super insight into your unconscious, and that it gave you ideas about what really causes you to act the way that you do. And of course, neurotic guilt. The idea that guilt comes from, a lot of our behaviors come from trying to overcome some type of guilt issue. One of our largest changes in regards to technology is in agriculture. The modern changes in technology we call the Green Revolution, and basically the Green Revolution produced food for the Earth's growing population. One of the biggest issues was making sure that now that people are living longer, that we have enough food to provide for everyone. And the way to do that was to use chemicals in our agriculture and to genetically modify our food so that we can create more superfoods. Sometimes the Green Revolution is referred to as the Third Agricultural Revolution. It began in the 1930s in the U.S., where basically the Midwest started experimenting with seed variations. What they were trying to do was figure out how to make the farming process more efficient so that they could grow more food quicker with less work. One of the biggest problems is weeds and insects. So they wanted to find a way to create seed variations that would become resistant to seeds, or resistant to weeds, or resistant to insects. An American philanthropist actually created a hybrid corn seed, and we actually sent that down into Mexico in the 1960s. And Mexico was having a famine issue, and they had a drought, and so one of the things that they wanted to do was find a way to create a corn seed that was more drought resistant. They were successful, and Mexico actually was able to stop importing their corn. It's not the case anymore. Mexico actually imports most of its corn because now everybody's middle class because they're all making our cars. IR8 is a rice form that was produced in the 1960s. It's a cross between a Chinese rice and an Indonesian rice. Basically what they were doing was developing a bigger head of grain which had a stronger stem, so it was more resistant and to wind damage and things like that. In 1982, IR36 was bred. You can see obviously the numbers are associated with the amount of how many pieces of rice they've tried to create. IR36 has 13 different parent grains, and it has a genetic resistance to 15 different pests, and it can grow in 110 days. It's the most grown rice in the world. In fact, most of the rice that you purchase at the store is probably an IR36. Most famines today are caused by political instability and natural disasters, like sudden natural disasters, has nothing to do with the lack of available food. India was the most impacted country by the Green Revolution. Of course, part of that is because their climate is used for growing rice, and rice is part of their cultural diet, so it would make sense. And India became super self-sufficient by the 1980s. Asia had an increase of 2/3 in their rice production between 1970 and 1995. The International Rice Institute is actually housed in the Philippines, and they're still working on rice breeds. The next area where we're going to start genetically modifying some of our grains they're working on wheat right now. Rice was first simply because more people eat rice in the world than any other grain. Negatives of the Green Revolution, basically, all the focus on rice, wheat, and corn limits the impact on Africa. Africa cannot grow any of these grains. Their proteins are found in root vegetables and like sorghum and millet, and those things have not even been part of the Green Revolution at all. And so Africa has not been impacted by the Green Revolution in any way. Also, Africa has some issues with their soil fertility, so people don't want to invest in African agriculture, and so Africa has to spend a lot of time and energy importing their food. The African countries that are able to produce any agricultural crops do so with commercial farming. So like Kenya has a huge export of coffee, but they have to import all their food. And the people who work on the coffee fields are not really given a livable wage, and so they can't really even purchase the food that is imported because it's more expensive because it's imported. So there's kind of this catch-22 that's associated with the Green Revolution. Within the Green Revolution today, like I said, the International Rice Research Institute is working on a super rice where you don't have to use seedlings. The way that rice is formed is that you have these seedlings in this nursery, and then you have to transfer the seedlings into the wet rice fields. Well, that process is long, arduous, and requires a lot of labor. If they can make a super rice that doesn't use seedlings, then they can skip an entire step and possibly get 2-3 crops out of one season. And they, of course, are still working on resistance to pests and diseases. And they're working on new agricultural products. So what we call these products that are coming out of the Green Revolution are called GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. So you've seen this non-GMO movement as of late, especially in the United States. Most countries in Europe actually ban the use of GMOs. They do not allow genetically modified foods within their countries, within their production of food at all. The FDA in the United States has no problem with GMOs. Part D. Medical innovations increase the ability of humans to survive. This is why we increased our population. We're looking at beyond just lowering infant mortality rates, we're actually expanding life expectancy on a large scale. What you're looking at is the different life expectancies throughout the different time periods that we've looked at. So when we were hunter-gatherers, most people lived to be about 33. When we started farming in living villages, the life expectancy dropped to 20. During the Bronze and Iron Age, we're looking at 26. Classical Greece and Rome, we're looking at late 20s into the 30s. Before the Europeans show up in North America, most of your Native Americans would live to in between 25 and 30 years old. Medieval Islamic areas in the Middle East, you could live to be 35 or plus. Remember, that's partly because the Muslims had a much better grasp of medical knowledge, and also they did things like clean themselves and wash their hands. In medieval Britain, you would live to be about 30. In early modern Britain, we're looking at a huge range between 25 and 40. Early modern Britain, I'm really talking about with the development of the Industrial Revolution. That's why the age range is so large there, because many people died as a result of industrialization accidents and things like that. Plus, you have so much diversity within the social classes. In the early 20th century, like pre-World War II, you would live to be 31. In 2010, the world average life expectancy was 67.2. So we're talking within the last 100 years, we have changed our life expectancy from 31 years old to 67.2. That's a huge jump. Why were we able to live so long? One of them is vaccines. The development of the idea of vaccines was back in 1798. Basically, there was a form of disease that was called cowpox. Any type of pox has some type of marking on the skin. That's why it's called a pox. And basically, the way a vaccine works is that you put a form of the microorganism into the body, and the immune system can destroy it. Therefore, your immune system will always be able to combat that disease. So, 1978, they used it to combat cowpox, and then polio. Vaccines were developed in the 1950s. Polio was one of the worst diseases that was affecting children throughout the early post-World War II era, and developing the polio vaccine completely changes and eliminates the disease altogether. We've also eliminated a couple other diseases like smallpox as a result of this. The modern anti-vaccine movement that's associated with the development of autism and the idea that the mercury and some of the materials in vaccines can impact mental health, like can cause things like autism and whatnot, has recently created outbreaks of old diseases. There's been an outbreak of whooping cough here recently. A couple other diseases are coming back because people are not vaccinating their children. Antibiotics were developed in 1928. The first antibiotic was penicillin. Basically, your antibiotic is only to kill bacteria. A virus, like a cold virus or a flu virus, is not going to respond to antibiotics. This is one of the problems in the United States. Antibiotics are always given to people, and as a result, these viruses and these bacteria are morphing into worse diseases. And so we're getting sicker, and so the antibiotics are responding by getting larger and more aggressive. In 1942, the U.S. started to commercialize antibiotics, and they started using them throughout the post-World War II era. Using antibiotics should definitely be limited. If you have a cold, you probably don't need an antibiotic. It's just a virus. Bacteria is very different from viruses, and so make sure that you have some type of bacterial infection like a bronchitis before you're using antibiotics. Part E, new energy technologies raise productivity and increase the production of material goods. So basically, in the first industrial revolution, the only energy that we were using was hydroelectric with our water, with the water wheel, or coal, so with the steam engine. And so water and coal were super important. Lumber is also important. In the modern day, we have different forms of energy. Here's an example of some of the energy sources that we use. Fossil fuels are anything associated with oil, coal, anything that's natural. About 81% of our consumption comes from fossil fuels. Only 16.7% of our energy sources are renewable. Nuclear is a very small amount of energy source. One of the reasons why we're hesitant to use nuclear energy is because of the toxic waste that it creates. You can look at the breakdown of the renewable energy sources, the types of sources that we could possibly be using. Solar power is currently on the U.S. government's radar in regards to development. They are doing a lot of tax incentives for using solar energy throughout the United States, and they're trying to get people to convert. Pool heaters can use solar energy. They're creating air conditioning units that use solar energy. You can actually install a solar energy hot water heater in your house as well. But as of right now, the cost of putting those things into your house does not translate into any type of savings in your fuel costs yet. They have to make these things, these solar energy panels are expensive to make, and they have to find a way to make those more efficiently so that they're more affordable to the common people. Here are our oil reserves as of 2009. You can see the majority of our oil is in Saudi Arabia. We use it. You can see Canada actually has quite a bit of an oil reserve. The issue is that we are unsure about these numbers. We are not positive about the oil reserves in these areas. Some countries may be lying about that. Oil is a fossil fuel and it's therefore non-renewable. I hope you know what a fossil fuel is. If you don't, please ask in class. Crude oil was developed in 1847, and that was part of the process of industrialization. And then we were able to figure out petroleum, gas, at the turn of the century. 90% of transportation energy comes from gas, and in the United States, 40% of our energy consumption is made up of gas, of petroleum. 62.5% of oil comes from the Arab Five: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iraq, Qatar, and Kuwait. 40% of all textiles contain oil. So the clothing that you wear, the blankets that you have, the sheets that you sleep on, the towels you use when you take a shower, all contain oil. A single sofa in their production. A single sofa contains 60 liters of oil. So to make the sofa that you may be sitting on right now, it took 60 liters to make that sofa. And then you have to include the transportation cost as well. So oil is not just for our cars. We use oil to make our products as well. Roman numeral 2. Humans fundamentally change their relationship with the environment. This is a big deal. If you get any type of CCOT in the modern world, and it's broad enough, please include a paragraph about the environment. A. Humans exploited and competed over the Earth's finite resources more intensely than ever before in human history. Part of the reason why we're fighting more and we're competing over our resources more now than we ever have before is because there's more people now than there ever has been before. And our material needs are so much more complex than they used to be. There's a couple oil wars. One of them is the Sudan and South Sudan in 2012. This is associated with the genocide that happened there. Remember that South Sudan has now that it's a country, it actually has quite a lot of oil in it, and Sudan wanted to try to basically use that oil, and South Sudan said, no, we need that, and so there's still conflict going on there. The South China Sea is being fought over by quite a bit of major countries, including South Korea, a lot of Southeast Asian countries, and Japan. Japan, of course, has no natural oil, and they are short on natural resources, so they want to tap into the South China Sea oil. But the control of the South China Sea is actually international water, so it's difficult to figure out which country should be refining the oil. And so there's individual companies that are being supported and backed by different companies. Egypt and Israel still fighting over oil. There's oil reserves in the Sinai Peninsula, and so there is issues with who should be able to mine that oil and sell it. Argentina actually at one point tried to seize the Falkland Islands. This was back in the 1980s. The Falkland Islands belong to Great Britain. They have for many centuries. And Margaret Thatcher actually went to war with Argentina in order to keep control of the Falkland Islands because of the oil that's there. And then, of course, you have everything associated with Iran and Iraq, totally based in oil. We like to use things like democracy and changing governments and all of that kind of stuff to justify why we're there. However, when you really come down to it, it's about oil. Water is also an issue. 11% of the world's population does not have access to usable water. 11% does not have usable water. Children are drinking water and getting dysentery and dying from just bad water resources. There's conflict amongst Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine over water. Israel is dominating and winning that war right now. The Nile River also causes problems between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. We're not just talking about necessarily water for consumption, but also water for hydroelectricity and things like that. That's where the Nile River issue is. The Aral Sea is causing conflict between Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, the Aral Sea has actually is drying up. And as less and less water is available there through the Aral Sea, the countries are getting more and more volatile against each other. Part B, global warming was a major consequence of the release of greenhouse gases and other pollutants into the atmosphere. Whether or not you believe global warming is real, and whether or not believe global warming has actually happened, in this class it has, so please keep that in mind during the AP exam. Global warming is the idea that the atmosphere is holding on to more heat due to pollution. The idea is that the atmosphere, which throughout history has been able to clean itself, the atmosphere is self-cleaning. Anytime there's been a major volcanic eruption or anything like that, the atmosphere has been able to adjust and atmosphere has eventually cleared. Well, the atmosphere is no longer clearing because of the chemicals that we're putting into it. If the heat continues to go up, the sea levels could raise 6 inches. Florida is currently at sea level, so basically what that would mean is that Jacksonville could possibly disappear. It's also affecting our hydroelectric cycle, which affects our patterns of precipitation. One of the reasons why we have so many droughts lately is because the water cycle has been interrupted by pollution and by global warming. Greenhouse gases have been increasing in the atmosphere at 2% per decade. So if we continue, it's just going to get worse. This is just for fun. Part C. Pollution threatened the world's supply of water and clean air. Deforestation and desertification were continued consequences of the human impact on the environment, and rates of extinction of other species accelerated sharply. Deforestation. This is happening mainly because of population increases. We're clearing out more and more trees for living space. We're not even clearing out the trees for agriculture reasons. We have enough agricultural land because we are genetically modifying our food. But we don't have enough places to put people. So instead of going up, a lot of places are going out, and we're cutting down trees. 44% of tropical rainforests have been affected, with only 1% being used for logging. That's the other weird part. We're chopping down the trees, but then we're not using the wood at all. Equatorial rainforests will be completely gone in 90 years. We're talking about an entire ecosystem. We're not talking just about trees. We're talking about animals. We're talking about plants, other species. It's not just the trees that are an issue. This will affect, there have been efforts to reforest areas, but we haven't made a dent in it yet. Desertification is where basically water dries up. Streams that provide water to the Aral Sea have been diverted for irrigation, and pesticides get into the groundwater, which means the sea is drying up. The Aral Sea has lost 2/3 of its total surface area thus far. Here's a map of that, so you can see why Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are fighting. And in the mid-60s, you can see that the Aral Sea was quite large, and it had a delta in Uzbekistan. Now, in the early 2000s, the water is very limited, and there's not even a delta anymore. This is impacting water supplies and irrigation systems, which will impact agriculture. Water is more important than food, because we cannot grow anything without water. Roman numeral 3 is about disease. Diseases, scientific innovations, and conflict led to demographic shifts. So what we're looking at is major population changes. Part A, diseases associated with poverty persisted. So in other words, if you're poor, then you're still going to get sick. Poverty diseases are something that are hard to eradicate, and it's not something that really has developed quite yet. While other diseases emerged as new epidemics and threats to human survival. Like I was saying before, because of diseases are caused by living organisms who evolve into super diseases, and that's causing problems as well. In addition, changing lifestyles and increased longevity led to higher incidence of certain diseases. Because we're living longer, and because we don't necessarily eat, and we're obese, and we're overweight, and we don't necessarily take care of ourselves, we end up with diseases that are new. These diseases are new simply because people are living longer, and the bodies have the opportunity to even create the diseases. A lot of the diseases that we're dealing with today didn't even exist before we were living to be 68 years old. Poverty, one of the largest diseases associated with poverty is malaria. Malaria is part of the reason why malaria is considered a poverty disease is because it's really caused by standing water and the lack of clean water and the lack of the ability to clean that water. If you notice in the United States, we don't have malaria. One of the reasons for that is we control our mosquito population, and we're very careful about watching for standing water and treating standing water for mosquitoes. You can see Africa and India are one of the largest areas in regards to malaria spread, and again, that's because of the lack of ability to clean water. Tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a bacterial disease that spreads. It's an airborne bacterial disease, and it can spread through the air very easily. You can see in the United States, we don't even have it. Tuberculosis, in 2010, there were 8.8 million new cases and 1.5 million deaths. Because it's not, it's an airborne illness, you cannot necessarily create a vaccine for it. Tuberculosis is associated with poverty because the air quality is bad in a lot of slums and in poor areas, and that aids the spread. Also, tuberculosis comes from things like you are more susceptible to tuberculosis if you have lack of access to nutrition and health care and things like that. And so all of that is why it's considered a poverty disease. Cholera. Cholera is a waterborne illness. It really was a problem throughout the Industrial Revolution. It's basically a bacteria that gets into water, and then once you ingest it, it will basically kill you. Africa has a large amount of cholera outbreaks lately. India used to. India is actually doing pretty well with their cholera outbreaks. Africa is having a huge problem cleaning their water enough to avoid cholera outbreaks. The Industrial Revolution, they were able to figure out how to clean and treat water so that cholera is not going to spread in industrial regions at all. Pandemic. A pandemic is basically a disease that's going to spread throughout the world and can have a massive impact. One of the modern age's largest pandemic was a flu at the end of World War I. It's an H1N1 strain. H1N1 you guys should be familiar with. It is a flu that we recently, in the past 8 years, we had an outbreak in North America. And World War I, unfortunately, is going to help spread the disease because the soldiers, the disease started to spread as the soldiers were going home, and that precipitated the spread of the disease. And it infected 500 million people across the globe, and many actually died from the influenza disease. Mainly in Britain and France actually was impacted the most by this. They lost the largest amount of their population. HIV and AIDS. 3.42 million people today are living with AIDS. In 2010, 1.8 million people died from complications associated with the disease. You don't die from AIDS. AIDS is an autoimmune disorder, so basically your immune system gets broken down due to the bacteria that's attacking your immune system. And so as a result of that, if you get like a cold, it will end up as pneumonia. And like we said, antibiotics are not going to save you when you have something like pneumonia, or once your lungs start filling with fluid, that's it. 30 million people have died from it since its identification. It was first identified in the early 80s. If you guys have seen Forrest Gump, the disease that Ginny has is HIV/AIDS. It spreads through bodily fluids, so if you share needles or any type of sexual relationship with someone who has AIDS, then more than likely you're going to infect yourself with the disease. AIDS, people have been convicted of murder by knowingly having unprotected sex with other people. HIV and AIDS was used in the Rwandan genocide to eradicate the Tutsi people. The women were not directly killed, they were actually just infected with AIDS, which means any children that they produce will be infected with AIDS and ultimately kill out the entire ethnicity. And Africa is the state with the largest amount of AIDS. And again, that goes back to education about how it spreads and why it spreads, and the availability of things like condoms. That's not something that's readily available in Africa. And as a result of that, nor do Africans know how to use them or why to use them. And it's not something that one of the easiest ways to eradicate something like AIDS would be through education of women. This is the same map that was on the previous slide, just a little bit larger to give you a moment to look at it. Notice that the age is from 15 to 49. That's one of the worst parts about AIDS, is the fact that it's actually mainly children. Diabetes. Diabetes is a disease that there's two types of diabetes. You have type 1 diabetes, which is when you're born with your pancreas not producing enough insulin. Type 2 diabetes is because of your diet. Type 2 diabetes is that you have abused your pancreas to a point where it can no longer function correctly. And as a result of that, you have to aid the pancreas with the use of insulin or some type of other medication. You can see that the number with diabetes and the percent of diabetes has just steadily gone up since the mid-90s. Why? Soda, sugar, fast food restaurants. We are consuming a huge amount of sugar every day, and our bodies cannot process it. And it's not just pure sugar. In fact, if you're going to eat sugar, at least make it pure cane sugar. The high fructose corn syrup that was developed in the early to mid-90s is really part of the reason for this, because it's a chemical. The high fructose corn syrup is a chemical that our bodies are not prepared to actually deal with, and that is just continually increasing diabetes. Diabetes goes beyond just having to use insulin. You can go blind as a result of diabetes. You can also lose limbs with diabetes, because diabetes affects circulation within your body, and so if you lose blood flow to your foot, then you're going to lose your foot. It has a huge impact on sight, your eyes, and of course your other health issues. It can increase your possibility for having heart problems as well. So there's all kinds of things, other things associated with diabetes. And diabetes, type 2 diabetes is a disease that comes from the food choices that we make. So it is something that can be totally controlled, and not something that, in a world where people don't have any food, and in the United States we're overeating to the point where we're giving ourselves diseases, it's just slightly ridiculous. Here you can look at the breakdown between race, age, and sex in regards to diseases, or in regards to diabetes, and you can see the cost associated with diabetes. The direct cost of diabetes in 2007 in the United States was $1.16 billion to treat and care for people who have diabetes. You can see that men have more diabetes than women, and you can see that African Americans come out with more diabetes than others. So you can see that those who are uninsured, 9.2% of people with diabetes in the United States did not have insurance. That means that they were being helped and cared for through government services. And again, this is all associated with diet. In the world, you can see the impact in the world in regards to 592 million people have diabetes, or could have diabetes by 2035 if we continue on the diet that we're in. You can see the different countries and the different regions where the increase would be most prevalent. Heart disease. Heart disease is also associated with lack of care. Increasing cholesterol is associated with how much fat you're putting into your body, and the more fat you consume, the less your body can cleanse out of your veins and into your arteries, and as a result those things get clogged, and that's why your heart will give out. You can see that, believe it or not, white women are having more heart attacks than any other race in the United States. And heart disease, again, is associated with obesity, diet choice. It's also genetic. High cholesterol can also be genetic. However, a lot of more than not, heart attacks are associated with the diet choices that you're making. Here's more information from the American Heart Association. 35% of America has an immediate family member who has had a heart attack or some type of heart disease. 6% of Americans have had some type of personal experience with a heart attack. The problem is that that it's something that can be prevented through cardio work. The heart is a muscle. You have to work it out. You have to actually take care of yourself in order for to prevent some of these diseases from happening. Here's a global perspective on heart disease. You can see that it's actually not necessarily in the United States. One of the biggest problems is smoking. Smoking increases the chance that you can have a heart attack. The United States has been doing a really good job of anti-smoking campaigns, and I just can't even imagine that any of you would even take up the habit at this point, because you know that it's bad, and so that is something that has changed in the United States on a large scale. A lot of the rest of the world still smokes, and that's part of the problem. Part B, more effective forms of birth control have given women greater control over fertility and transformed sexual practices. Okay. There's several different birth control options for women. The idea of birth control and the idea of controlling how many children you have has changed lives for women. In the 1950s, 1960s, the pill was introduced. It was a feminist issue. It was difficult for women to gain access to the pill. Doctors were not readily prescribing it, and the pill actually came out of other purposes. Like, the pill was developed to treat skin and a couple other things, and it ended up being that one of the side effects is infertility, that you can't get pregnant while you're on it, and so it was an accidental creation. The availability and the choices that women have for birth control has increased since the 1950s, but there still are regulations about it, and there still are people who do not necessarily have access to the same thing that Western women have. Why is it important to be able to control how many children you have? Part of it is your health. Continuous pregnancies and continuous births can cause some damage to a woman's body. It is a difficult process. It is something that can age a woman. It is something that can make, it increases obesity in the United States, multiple pregnancies. And another issue is that women don't necessarily have postpartum care that is associated with helping them deal with some of the ramifications of having a pregnancy. Pregnancy was just a way of life throughout most of history, and so the idea of controlling that was new for this time period. The other issue for women is not just necessarily control over their body, but it's also about the availability of their access to careers, to education. Limiting your amount, preventing yourself from having children early in your 20s or your 30s can allow you to build a career which can actually help you raise children a little bit better. Children can be, your family can be more economically stable. Obviously, I am going to speak in the positive in regards to this. As I went to college, I have a career, so you can take my bias into consideration when listening to this lecture. A lot of Westerners feel that access to birth control and even the legalization of something like abortion is a right for women, and that pregnancies and limiting women in regards to keeping them pregnant or keeping them in the home taking care of children is actually a power issue, and that it is a political issue associated with the power between men and women. Whether you agree with that or not is up to you. The idea of the access to birth control being, or something that people can pay for as well, or something that insurance should even be paying for, has come up as a topic as of late. I feel like we should speak about this more in class than on through the lecture.